Story number one. When things got complicated with my parents, I had to move. I was on a rough patch as far as my housing situation. I couldn't keep sleeping on my friends' couches for long. I was looking through all the roommate and apartment apps and websites and found something that caught my eye in one of these apps. A man named Lucas had listed a room for rent in his one-story, three-bedroom home. The rent was $200 a month. Basically, he would be my landlord and roommate, as he would also live in the house. He assured in the advertisement that he would be out of the house most of the time and that the tenant would have the place to himself often. However, he capitalized some basic rules, including no parties, no large gatherings, no drinking in the living room, and no use of the basement. They seemed like pretty standard rules. I went to see the house in person and meet Lucas. The moment he opened the door, I had a first impression that he was a bit reserved. His demeanor was calm and a little awkward. He showed me around the house and I could tell he was nervous because his voice was shaking and stuttering. The bedroom was a good size and the floor plan of the house was good, with an open layout that integrated the kitchen, living room, and dining room into one large space. For $1,000 a month in my area, it was a steal. He explained more rules to me in person and emphasized again that I couldn't go to the attic or basement as I used them only for storage. It sounded fair enough. On the spot, I told him I was interested. We shook hands, I left, and 2 days later, I was moving. We do not draft any kind of contract or agreement. I would only pay him in cash month by month on the first day of every month. I settled in pretty quickly. The bedroom I was renting was already furnished with a bed and basic furniture, so I just hung some decorations on the wall and filled the dresser and closet with clothes. Fortunately, the room had a lock and he gave me the key so I could lock it when he wasn't home, which I thought was a kind gesture at first. Lucas never told me what he did for a living. He just mentioned that he wouldn't usually be home, but I quickly learned that wasn't true. Whenever he came home from work, his car was always in the driveway. I started noticing loud noises outside my room at night, from footsteps to doors constantly opening and closing. One night, I went out in the middle of the night just to go to the bathroom and noticed that the basement door was open. I walked over to the top of the stairs and looked down. There was a dim light coming from a corner out of sight. I heard banging coming from there. It was 2 a.m. What could I be doing down there? Then the knocking stopped, and Lucas appeared at the bottom of the stairs and looked at me. It was so creepy that describing it in words doesn't do it justice. He looked visibly upset as he looked at me. I apologized and said I was just going to the bathroom. Almost angrily, he told me to close the basement door. I listened to him, completely surprised, went to the bathroom, and then went back to bed. I stayed awake for a long time after that, my mind racing, wondering what I was doing. A week later, I returned home and noticed that my bedroom door was unlocked, and he always locked it before he went out each day. I looked around my room to see if anything was missing, and while nothing seemed to be missing, I noticed that some things had been moved. To begin with, my clothes on the dressers were no longer tidy. They had been checked, I could tell. The closet door was also ajar. I realized that he had his own key and had probably come into my room and checked my things. This felt like a clear invasion of privacy and a violation of my rights as a tenant. I had to confront him about it. I went to knock on his bedroom door, but he didn't answer. His car was in the driveway once. Again, so he had to be home. I was getting very strange vibes from all of this. I gave up and went back to my room after heating my dinner in the microwave. While I was in my room relaxing and watching TV, I heard the door to Lucas's room open. I took this opportunity to stand up and confront him. I went out into the living room and found him about to leave the house in a hurry. I stopped him and asked him if he had come into my room. He looked at me with a blank expression and said straight up no. I replied gently, without being hostile, saying that the door was unlocked and some of my things seemed to have been checked. Then he claimed that I had the only key to my room and said he was in a hurry, that he had to go, and left. I was stunned by all of this. I wanted to ask my parents for advice, but at the time I hated them and wanted nothing to do with them. I was already back on apps and websites looking for other places. I knew I didn't want to stay there. Then I realized that it was the first time Luke wasn't home while I was there. Curiosity got the better of me, and I had to take a look at the basement. I checked the windows first to make sure his car was gone, and it was. Then I went to open the basement door. Interestingly, I couldn't find any light switches, so I just used my phone's flashlight to navigate. The steps creaked so much that it seemed like I was in an abandoned house. I got to the bottom, and there was a beige rug that folded upwards on the walls as if it was ill-fitting to the floor. It was a very small basement, at least the master room. There was only an ugly couch in the middle of the room. There was also a slightly unpleasant smell, and the smell only got worse as I approached a door in the corner. I tried to open the door, but unfortunately it was closed, or maybe luckily, because I'm not sure if I really wanted to know what was there emitting that smell. It almost smelled like sewage, but worse. I did a quick check of the basement master room and found nothing, just a few sealed cardboard boxes that I wasn't going to open. I went back upstairs and closed the door. The rest of that night I stayed in my room. I never heard Lucas come back. He must have come back after I fell asleep. I woke up and the room was still dark. My alarm wasn't ringing. Something else had woken me up. I heard the floor next to my bed creak and turned and saw Lucas leaning over my bed looking at me. I yelled and he told me to shut up and then asked me if I had gone down to the basement. I yelled no and asked him how he got in, as he had locked the door. Then he asked me, "Are you sure?" I asked him back and yelled, "Did you come into this room when I wasn't home?" He said no, then turned and headed for the door. I asked him how he got in and saw him raise his hand in the dark. I wasn't holding anything at the time. I didn't know what it meant. He said to me before leaving the room, "I think you should look for another place to live," and then closed the door. I started packing my things right away. I wasn't going to stay another minute in that house. I knocked on his door and yelled at him to give me half the rent back since I had only been there 2 weeks. Moments later, he opened the door and only put his arm out holding a small pile of $100 bills. He even managed to make giving me the money extremely creepy. I took it. It was only $400, but it was close. I just wanted to get out of there. It was fully packed and out of there within an hour. I slept in my car that night. The next day I went back to my parents' house, and after explaining to them the craziness I had just gone through, something changed, and they were more welcoming to me. Still, I moved out a month later, but now my parents and I are fine. If you decide to have a random internet roommate, be careful and use your best judgment after meeting them. Story number 2. It was my junior year in college, and I had moved from campus to a student apartment building. My roommate, Ruben, was assigned to me by the university in the sense that he was someone else who needed a roommate. At first, he seemed to be a nice guy, friendly and polite, always smiling and making small talk. But as the days went by, I began to notice strange things about him, small details and strange behaviors that made me feel uncomfortable. It all started with the way Ruben always stayed in my room, asking insistent questions about my personal life and snooping through my stuff as if he was too comfortable doing so. At first, I took it as a harmless curiosity, although it seemed a bit odd to me. But the more I thought about it, the more they bothered me. Then there were the sounds I heard coming from Ruben's room late at night. Conversations and noises of movement that were somewhat troubling. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just Ruben watching TV or talking on the phone, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, unable to sleep because of the strange noises coming from Ruben's room, I decided to investigate. I slid silently down the hallway and pressed my ear against Ruben's door, straining to hear what was going on inside. What I heard was just strange. It was the sound of Ruben whispering to himself, his voice low and choked. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whisper stopped, and there was only silence. Then I heard, "Jeff?" Ruben said my name. Did he know I was outside his door? Quickly and quietly, I walked away from his door and back to my room. I climbed into bed without making a sound. I didn't know what to make of this. Why did Ruben talk to himself? Was he hiding something from me, or was he sleepwalking? But then how did he know he was out of his room? I couldn't shake off the feeling of discomfort. The next day I kept thinking about the night before. As the days went by and the sounds of Ruben's room persisted, my paranoia only got worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ruben was hiding something from me. Ruben's behavior also became more bizarre. I began to notice small, subtle changes in his behavior, such as strange glances at me and furtive movements. One night, I woke up at an unusual hour to hear Ruben's whispering voice in the hallway, just outside my door. It was really freaking out, and I was wondering if I was sleepwalking. I went to the door and put my ear to it, and like last time, the whispers stopped, and then David once again said, "Jeff." This time I answered and said, "Yes, are you okay?" He didn't answer. I just heard his footsteps, walking away toward his room. The next night I woke up to the sound of my door closing. I heard Ruben's footsteps walking away down the hallway. This was getting out of control. The next day I decided to confront him about his possible sleepwalking. I told him that I had heard him walking at night and that I heard him close my door the night before. I then asked him if he had ever been diagnosed as sleepwalking or some kind of sleep disorder. At first she didn't know how to respond, but then she said yes, she tended to sleepwalk sometimes. I didn't believe it. Something was going on. I decided to look for answers in Ruben's room. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. I waited until Ruben was out of the apartment and then slipped into his room. I knew I might not have much time, so I searched quickly, going through drawers and closets for something that could explain Ruben's strange nocturnal behavior. And then, just as I was about to give up, I found it. An inconspicuous little drawer tucked away in the back of Ruben's closet. I opened it, and my blood ran cold at the sight of what was inside. A collection of photographs, dozens of them, mostly of me sleeping, and another boy who looked our age. They were taken from different angles and distances, some so close that I could see the pores of my skin and the individual hairs on my head. I felt nauseous as I realized what I was seeing. Ruben had been secretly taking pictures of me while I slept without my knowledge or consent. I couldn't believe it. I had been living with a sick guy, a depraved guy who was probably somehow turned on by these photos. He had been violating my privacy and invading my personal space for who knows how long. I wanted to confront Ruben and demand answers, but I was afraid of what he might do, afraid of what he might say, afraid of what might happen if I confronted him alone. So I took a picture of the contents of the drawer and then took a handful of the photos as evidence to use against Ruben. I packed my things and the next day showed the photos to the department in charge of student housing accommodations, and they told me to let them take the appropriate action. I got lucky and was assigned to a different apartment with a normal person who needed a roommate. I never spoke to Ruben again. Even now, years later, I can't forget those chilling photographs and Ruben's whispers and movements at night. I never figured out who the other guy was in the photos. It was definitely his old roommate, but I could never figure out his name. But who knows? Maybe he also discovered the truth. Story number 3. When I was 23, I had to move out of state for work. I'm still working for the same company, but I've been able to return to my hometown and work in the local office. At the time, I needed a place to live that wasn't very expensive. I posted an ad on almost every website looking for a roommate: Facebook, Craigslist, Twitter, and even on my neighborhood page. A guy named Tomas contacted me on Facebook saying that he had a room available in his house. I looked at his pictures to see if he looked like a normal person, and he did. I was open to the idea of having a male roommate as long as it seemed normal, even though my parents were very much against it. Tomas and I made a video call where he gave me a virtual tour of the house. Apparently he owned the house, which was modest and in the center of town, just a 10-minute drive from my office. Also, he seemed quite friendly, and I didn't have any bad impressions. The price and the rules he set were reasonable. He told me I could move right away, which was perfect. A week later, I had all my stuff packed and drove there. I met Tomas in front of the house, where he greeted me and handed me a key. The first thing I noticed was that he was very short, the same height as me. He helped me carry some of the larger, heavier bags inside and showed me my room, which was already furnished. He told me that one of his friends had lived there and had recently moved in. I replaced all the pillows and sheets with my own, of course. I spent the rest of the day settling in. I saw that Thomas was trying to get to know me better and make me feel at home, but he wasn't too friendly yet. The next day, which was Sunday, Tomas offered to take me for a walk around the city to show me the shopping malls, restaurants, and so on. I wasn't very enthusiastic, but I accepted to get off to a good start. He took us for a walk and then suggested we go for lunch. I wasn't hungry, and his proposal seemed more like a date, so I politely declined. He then suggested we go get a drink instead, but I turned that down as well, saying I didn't drink on weekdays. He was a little insistent, but I kept my stance, and he finally gave up, although he was quiet and looked annoyed. I'll admit, I felt a little uncomfortable, but nothing I couldn't handle. That week was my first week on the job, and my focus was on adjusting to the new job. It wasn't until a few days later, upon getting home and doing laundry, that I noticed that my laundry basket seemed to have been moved. I couldn't find a pair of my underwear. I searched my room from top to bottom, but he didn't show up. I had the unsettling thought that Thomas might be involved, but I refused to believe it at the time and didn't dare confront him. Still, I began to wish I had a deadbolt on my bedroom door. That weekend, I bought a lock from Ace Hardware and installed it when Thomas wasn't home. I thought I'd tell him the next time I saw him, but he didn't come home that night. That night, I woke up to a knock on my bedroom door. It was Thomas calling me, and he didn't seem happy. I looked at the time, and it was like 1:30 in the morning. I decided to pretend I was asleep, as I was afraid to open the door. I assumed it had to do with the lock, and he was right. The next morning, I woke up to several messages from Thomas saying we needed to talk. I responded by asking if it was the lock, and he confirmed that it was. I apologized and told him I planned to tell him. He responded by saying that he should remove it that same day. His tone was unpleasant and strange. I thought about my next answer more carefully and explained that, as a woman, I felt safer having privacy in my room. His response was a little kinder, but he still insisted that he should remove the lock and put the old one back on. I felt confused and upset, but I had to respect his rules, as I had installed it without his permission. I wondered how he knew I had changed it, since I didn't leave the old one in plain sight. The thought of him trying to break into my room that night scared me. The next day, I changed the lock and returned the one I had bought. Things got really bad when one day, while Thomas wasn't home, a girl my age knocked on the door. He asked me if I lived there with Thomas, and I said yes. He warned me to get out of there immediately, as Thomas had multiple restraining orders from different girls and was known to be a dangerous stalker. I was speechless, and asked him how he knew I was there. He told me that he knew he was trying to rent his room and that he wasn't surprised that he had chosen a girl. He told me that he saw me move and waited until he wasn't home to warn me. I thanked him so much and I was really terrified. I had already paid Thomas for the whole month and didn't know what to do. She offered to help me in any way she could. I took her number and left. I started packing my things and looking for other places where I could move. I found a studio on the other side of town that was subletting for a little more money. I contacted the person offering it, and he said I could move in as soon as possible, which was perfect. Now I just needed to tell Thomas and get my money back. I started packing some things in my car and sent him a message saying I would have to move out the next day due to a family matter. He didn't answer right away, but he came back to the house an hour later and asked me about my message. I made up the best story possible, and he said he would refund my money the next day after I went to the bank. I was so relieved. An hour later, he knocked on my door and asked if any girls had said anything to me. I just said no and asked what he meant. He said it didn't matter, but he seemed to suspect there was another reason for my departure. I insisted it was just because of family matters, and he eventually gave up. Sadly, the story didn't end there. That night, I woke up screaming when I saw a black figure sitting at the foot of my bed. It was Thomas. He put his hand over my mouth and said, "Shh." I begged him not to hurt me, and he replied, "Why would he hurt you?" She said she knew someone had said something to me and that I shouldn't believe what those girls were saying. I told him he was scaring me, and to my surprise, he started stroking my leg, saying he didn't want to scare me. I got out of bed and ran to the door as he yelled at me to stop. I ran outside with my phone in hand and called the police. I hid in some bushes until they came, and I explained the whole situation to them. They had Thomas come out and tell his side of the story. Basically, I told them I just wanted to get all my stuff out of the room and leave. The cops stayed while I gathered my belongings and took them to the car. I insisted that Tomas return my money while the cops were there, and he did. All the while, he tried to act like a normal person. One of the officers told me privately that Tomas had been arrested before for other incidents with women, but Thomas denied entering my room or touching me, so it was all a he said, she said thing. I left the house and headed straight to a hotel for the night. The next day, I moved into the studio. Luckily, the girl who sublet it was able to facilitate my quick move. I've never moved in with a man other than my boyfriend again.